Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about ordinary people who at some point made a decision that not only completely changed their lives, but also impacted the lives of millions and millions of other people as well. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please rewire the like button's house so that every time they turn on their desk lamp, the stove turns on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in the early spring of 1943, a 29-year-old woman named Carolyn hunched over a sink basin that was inside of a laboratory in a U.S. government building in Washington, D.C. And this basin was full of this greenish-blue liquid that smelled so bad it actually was making Carolyn nauseous. But she couldn't leave the room, because this was her job. I mean, this was a highly classified and potentially life-saving thing that she was doing. And so Carolyn checked the recipe one more time on the clipboard right next to her, and then measured out 1 cup of the special type of acidic salt, and she poured it into the liquid, and she sort of plugged her nose as it began to bubble and more gross vapors began to come up into the air. So Carolyn worked for a government agency called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA. Carolyn had actually tried first to join the Navy and also the Army. She had applied to do administrative work because at the time, women were not allowed to do anything in combat roles. However, both the Navy and the Army turned her down for a really weird reason. So at the time, these 2 branches of the military were looking for people to fill their administrative roles. Namely, they were looking for secretaries. But specifically, they were seeking secretaries who could take notes in meetings and go basically completely unnoticed. But Carolyn was sort of impossible to ignore. She was 6 foot 2 inches tall, and she had a booming voice and a huge personality. And so basically, she drew a lot of attention, and the military had known that very likely her presence would be too distracting in these meetings, and so that's why they turned her down. So, when she was rejected, Carolyn had gone on to apply for work at the OSS, hoping to maybe become a spy. But they also turned her down really for the same reason. She was just too conspicuous to blend into a crowd, so how could she possibly be a spy? Now, for Carolyn, this had been sort of heartbreaking. I mean, it was sort of like, she thought she was going to be able to serve her country, and now she's being told, you basically can't. And so feeling like, she didn't have much to lose, she just went to the OSS and just said, look, I know I can't be a spy, but do you have any other jobs available that I could do? What do you got? Anything. I'm open to it. And it was through this approach that the OSS said, actually, yes, we do have something for you. And she would go on to become the executive assistant to one of the lead scientists for the OSS. And so now, in that capacity, she was working on a very important secret science project for the government. And so that day in the lab, after the mixture had stopped bubbling a little bit, Carolyn very carefully added some more ingredients. There was some copper acetate and black food dye, and then once they were in the wash basin as well, it was done. At this point, Carolyn very carefully scooped some of this mixture up in a ladle, and she poured it into a glass beaker and then handed it off to a lab assistant and told him she had followed the recipe exactly. He took the mixture and thanked her and told her he was now going to dehydrate it into several solid cakes, and then they would test it. A few weeks later, Carolyn was back in the laboratory, copying some notes from some of the more recent versions of the experiment she'd been working on. And she looked up when her boss, a scientist named Major Harold J. Coolidge, walked into the room. Major Coolidge was a scientist from Harvard University, and he was in charge of this whole secret project that Carolyn was working on. And he walked in, and he had a big smile on his face, and he put a memo down on the table in front of Carolyn. Carolyn grabbed it, and she read it over, and as she did, her heart began to race. The memo said that the U.S. Navy had taken different versions of the dehydrated cakes that they had been making, out into the ocean to shark-infested waters, and then attached these cakes to bags of raw fish meat and submerged them in the water. And a lot of curious sharks had come over to investigate the meat, but none of them had actually taken a bite. And this was exactly what Carolyn and her boss and her colleagues had all hoped for. So the government had basically hired the OSS to create a brand new life-saving product: shark repellent. And soon, this very same shark repellent that Carolyn worked on was actually issued to the entire US Navy. However, while this shark repellent was undoubtedly Carolyn's first big recipe, it would not be her last. After she left the OSS, she eventually moved to Paris, France, where her life would change forever. Because there, Carolyn fell in love with French cuisine. And even though she had literally zero culinary training, aside from, mixing up shark repellent recipes, she enrolled at a legendary culinary school called Le Cordon Bleu. Now, she was the only woman in her class, and at first, because again, she had no skills in cooking, she really struggled to hang on to the curriculum. But she would figure it out, and eventually she would not just graduate, she would go on to become an exceptionally talented chef. She went on to co-author a cookbook that sold more than 3.5 million copies, and then after that she landed a deal for a cooking show on TV. And viewers all over the world not only loved her cooking, but they really just fell in love with her, like her personality. And so she would go on to become one of the most beloved and influential chefs in history, credited with bringing French cooking into American homes. Before there was Gordon Ramsay or Barefoot Contessa, there was Carolyn, a 6'2" celebrity chef with a booming voice and a magnetic personality who used to make shark repellent. The very traits that initially kept her from serving her country made her unforgettable in every kitchen in America. Her middle name was Carolyn, but you know her as Julia Child. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS Debt for a real solution. PDS Debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS Debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment with zero credit impact. And savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS Debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS Debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. On the afternoon of June 12, 1962, an 18-year-old boy named George Jr. drove through his hometown of Modesto, California, on his way home for dinner. But, as he was driving, George Jr. could not help but feel like he was really dreading actually getting there. So he and his father had been fighting a lot lately, ever since he had told his dad that he did not want to go to college, and instead he wanted to become a race car driver. And his dad thought this was a ridiculous idea, and that George Jr. was wasting his potential. So George Jr. was a very smart kid. In particular, he was very good at art and photography, but he also got distracted really easily, and because of that, he really had not pursued anything all that seriously at any point in his life. That is, except for cars. A few years back, George Jr. had begun hanging around mechanic shops and sort of fell in love with cars. He thought they were fascinating. And at that point, his father actually bought him a small Italian car called a Fiat. And George Jr., after getting this car, sort of became obsessed with it, and he wound up souping up the engine and basically turned this little car into sort of like a race car. And he'd actually begun entering his little car into local car races. and he'd actually even won a few of these races. But his father, despite being the one who literally gave him the Fiat, he just didn't get his son's obsession with cars. Like, why aren't you able to, take that focus and apply it to other things, that will get you a real job and give you a real future? And so basically every dinner these days, it became this huge argument between father and son. But, George Jr., as frustrated as he was with the whole situation, couldn't really change it, at least not for now, because he still lived with his parents, and so he just had to accept that if they were going to fight, they were going to fight. And so George, he came to this intersection where it was right near his home. He just needed to make a left and, pull over, and he was home. He comes to a stop, he puts on his blinker, and he begins making the turn when he hears this really loud screeching sound and then feels his own car jolt forward, and then everything went black. 2 weeks later, George Jr. was laying in a hospital bed in the intensive care unit at the local hospital, watching daytime reruns on the TV in his room. He was in so much pain that he could barely move, so all he did was just watch TV. So 2 weeks earlier, when George was, making that turn and then something happened, well, what it was is another car came speeding down the road and smashed into George's car so hard that it sent his car, his little Fiat, flying, and it flipped 3 times, and while it was flipping, George Jr. was ejected from the car, and actually it saved his life, because the moment he was ejected, his car smashed into a tree and sort of wrapped around it. I mean, George was very badly hurt. He had multiple bone fractures, bruised lungs. I mean, he was really beaten up. But he had survived. However, the doctors told him that because of how extensive his injuries were, he would basically be recovering in bed in the hospital for months. But again, George Jr. just felt lucky to be alive at this point. And really, as he laid in bed, watching TV and just sort of stuck there, he began to think that, maybe this is my wake-up call. Maybe I do need to make some changes in my life. 2 years later, George Jr., who by this point was fully recovered from his injuries, stood at the finish line at a racetrack and raised his camera. And the race cars came whipping toward him on their last lap, and he snapped the photo finish. So since his near-death experience, George Jr. had made some big decisions. In the hospital after his accident, he had realized that really, his dad had been kind of right. That in some ways he was wasting his potential. So after getting out of the hospital, George Jr. had enrolled in community college, and he really applied himself to his schoolwork, to the point where his father was really impressed. Also, George Jr. had decided that he really didn't want to race cars anymore. He loved cars still, but it just felt like it was sort of reckless and not so much his thing anymore. Instead, he had, along with, focusing on his schoolwork, he had also picked up his camera and really gotten back into his old hobby of photography. In fact, George Jr. had grown to love photography so much that after community college, he had applied to the prestigious cinematography program at the University of Southern California. But after sending off his application, he was pretty sure he would not get in, because despite his efforts with his schoolwork at community college, he still knew his grades likely were not up to snuff. Now, George Jr. walked over to the podium to take some photos of the winning driver. But as he walked over there, this middle-aged man came up beside him and just asked George Jr. about his photography. They spoke for a few minutes, and then at some point the man actually formally introduced himself as Haskell Wexler. And he said that he was actually a cinematographer in Hollywood. And George Jr., when he heard this, he sort of felt starstruck. And he told Haskell about how he had recently applied to USC to try to get into their cinematography program, but, he felt like it was kind of a long shot. And when Haskell heard this, he said, "George, I know people at USC. Let me make some calls. I'll get you in." And sure enough, not long after this fateful meeting, George Jr. would receive an acceptance letter from USC's film school. But this moment in George Jr.'s life, receiving this unbelievable acceptance letter, did not just alter George's life forever. It also would go on to completely alter cinema in general forever. Because about 13 years later, George Jr. would go on to create one of the most groundbreaking films in history. His movie revolutionized sound design and visual effects, and it would go on to become part of the most successful movie franchise of all time. George Jr. is better known today as George Lucas, and his film franchise was Star Wars. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1938, 8-year-old Carolyn Jones hurried after her mother as they both carried platters of food down a street in Amarillo, Texas. It was Easter Sunday, and Carolyn and her mother were going to their neighbor's house to celebrate the holiday. Carolyn's dad was not in the picture, so when they had moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, Carolyn's mom had made a big effort to get to know their neighbors to make sure that they had a lot of friends and community and support around them. And so as a result, Carolyn's mom had actually really bonded with a specific middle-aged couple whose name was Mr. and Mrs. Franklin that lived right down the street. And that's whose house they were going to right now. And Carolyn was really excited because the Franklins had always been so nice to her, and this holiday dinner usually meant sweets and some fun Easter games like decorating eggs. Less than an hour later, Carolyn, her mother, and the Franklins were all sitting around the table eating some food. The grown-ups were having a very animated discussion about something very boring, and Carolyn was feeling just completely antsy. She just wanted this very boring adult part of the evening to end so she could have some candy and go play. And so while she's feeling this way, the phone rang in the Franklin's house. And since the grown-ups were very busy talking, Mrs. Franklin asked Carolyn if she wouldn't mind going and answering the phone and seeing who it was. So Carolyn, who was excited to have really anything to do at this point, she jumped up and she grabbed the phone and said, "Hello." And on the other end was an operator who said this was a collect call coming in from somebody named Joyce. Carolyn knew that Joyce was the Franklins' adult daughter. And also Carolyn knew from her own mother that Joyce had moved away a few years ago to go to school in Missouri. So when Carolyn heard this, she called over to the table and said there was a collect call coming in from Joyce. But when she did this, the room, which just a second ago had been, sort of noisy as the adults were chatting the whole time, the room went completely silent. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin just stared at Carolyn, and to Carolyn's surprise, they sort of looked mad. Then Mr. Franklin got up and he walked over to Carolyn and sort of aggressively took the phone out of Carolyn's hand, and then to the operator he said, "Put the call through." Carolyn felt like she'd done something wrong, but she had no idea what. So she was just feeling totally shocked and embarrassed and just kind of stepped aside to watch Mr. Franklin as he listened to the caller speak. It would turn out that in past years, at Easter dinners before this one, the Franklin's daughter, Joyce, would always make the drive home from her school in Missouri to be with her parents in Texas. And in years past, when she couldn't make the trip, she had always been really good about calling her parents and letting them know. And that was what Joyce had been calling about that night. When her father answered the phone and Joyce was put through, she said, "Daddy, I can't get home." But this year, Joyce's call was not routine. In fact, it was like the single most shocking thing that could have happened. Because a year earlier, during last Easter, when Joyce had been literally on her way home from school to see her parents, she'd gotten in a car accident and died. No one was ever able to explain that phone call, but the experience of being the one who actually answered the phone and being there when Mr. Franklin's face went white and he fainted, like that experience for 8-year-old Carolyn was incredibly formative. In fact, in many ways, it's like her life changed in that exact moment. And from that point forward, Carolyn really went on to fully embrace the macabre in her life. And through that, she ultimately became a very famous actress and scream queen, appearing in dozens of thrillers and horror films. Her most iconic macabre role was being Morticia Addams in the original Addams Family TV series. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. Alright, until next time.